Before we dive into this explosive story of betrayal, humiliation, and devastating revenge, I want you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for her journey. What you're about to witness is a tale that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about marriage, loyalty, and the deadly consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single twist in this incredible journey. My name is Christabel Simpson, and at 66, I thought I had learned every possible way a human being could be cruel. I was devastatingly wrong. The morning I burned our marriage certificate was exactly 23 years and 2 months after I'd first changed my husband's diaper. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I went from devoted wife to the woman who systematically destroyed everything my husband held dear, you need to know what happened in that hospital corridor. The moment I discovered that 23 years of sacrifice had been nothing more than unpaid domestic labor. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. October 15th, to be exact, a date now etched in my memory like a scar that refuses to fade. I was sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside my husband Connor's hospital bed, watching him sleep after his latest surgery. The doctors had warned us that his spinal injury complications were worsening, that he'd need even more intensive care when we returned home. Home. The word felt hollow in my mouth. For 23 years, our house had been more hospital than home, more prison than sanctuary. But I had accepted it all, the endless nights of turning him to prevent bed sores, the careful monitoring of his medications, the complete sacrifice of my own dreams and desires, because I believed it was what love looked like. Connor stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about physical therapy schedules. His face, still handsome despite the years of pain and medication, looked peaceful in a way it rarely did when he was awake. For a moment, I felt that familiar flutter of the love that had sustained me through 2 decades of caregiving. That flutter died permanently 30 minutes later. I had gone to get coffee from the machine down the hall, the bitter, overpriced hospital coffee that had become my primary source of caffeine. As I walked back toward Connor's room, I heard voices coming from inside. Male voices, laughing.
So lucky, man.
23 years of free care. That was Connor's voice, stronger and more animated than it had been in months. Seriously? The other voice belonged to his roommate, a man named Blake who was recovering from back surgery. She doesn't get paid anything? Connor's laugh was sharp, almost cruel. Not a dime. Christabel thinks it's all about love and duty and for better or worse. Meanwhile, I get around-the-clock nursing care that would cost me 6 figures a year, and all I have to do is act grateful now and then. I froze in the hallway, my plastic coffee cup trembling in my hands. "But she's your wife," Blake said, sounding confused. "She's a good-for-nothing, just a free maid," Connor replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "Sure, she used to be pretty. That's why I married her in the first place.
But now?
She's just useful. Like having a live-in nurse who works for room and board." "What happens when you don't need her anymore?" Blake asked. Connor's pause lasted forever. When he finally spoke, his words hit me like physical blows.
I've been thinking about that.
"My lawyer says if I claim mental instability from the medications, I could probably get her committed or at least declared an unfit caregiver. Then I could hire actual professionals and, well, Christabel would be someone else's problem." The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the floor with a splash that seemed to echo through the entire hospital. I stood there in the hallway, coffee seeping into my sensible nurse's shoes, feeling like someone had just performed surgery on my heart without anesthesia. 23 years. 23 years of my life, my youth, my dreams, my independence, all sacrificed for a man who saw me as nothing more than unpaid help. A man who was actively planning to have me declared mentally unfit, so he could dispose of me like a worn-out appliance. But Connor had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated exactly who he was talking about. You see, before Connor's accident, before I became his full-time caregiver, I had been something he had conveniently forgotten. Christabel Morrison, one of the most successful financial advisors in the state of California. I had built a portfolio worth $12 million before I was 35. I had managed investments for celebrities, politicians, and Fortune 500 CEOs. I had been featured on the cover of Financial Women magazine twice. And most importantly, I still had connections, resources, and a mind that 23 years of domestic servitude hadn't dulled. It had sharpened. I walked quietly back into the room, my face a mask of serene composure. Connor looked up at me with his practiced smile. The one I now realized was pure performance. "Hey, sweetheart. Blake was just telling me about his physical therapy progress. Maybe you could ask his nurse about." "I need to go home and get you some clean pajamas," I interrupted, my voice steady. "I'll be back this evening." "Of course," Connor said, already turning back to Blake. "Take your time." As I walked out of that hospital, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Clarity. Not the crushing weight of duty, not the exhausting cycle of caregiving, not the suffocating prison of a marriage built on my submission. Just cold, crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. Connor Simpson had called his wife a good-for-nothing free maid. He had plotted to have me declared mentally unstable. He had spent 23 years taking everything I had to give while planning my ultimate disposal. Now, he was going to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who had once made grown men tremble in boardrooms across the country. The drive home was a revelation. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Connor's medication schedule or his physical therapy appointments or his dietary restrictions. I was thinking about assets and accounts, investments and leverage, power and precision. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already begun planning the systematic destruction of Connor Simpson's entire world. He wanted to treat me like hired help.
Fine.
But hired help could quit, and when they did, they could take their skills and knowledge somewhere it would be appreciated. More importantly, hired help wasn't legally obligated to protect the interests of their employers. And Connor was about to discover that his free maid had been handling far more than just his personal care for the past 23 years. She had been managing his finances, his investments, his business interests, and every legal document that governed his life. All of it done with love, trust, and the assumption that we were partners building a future together. But partnerships required mutual respect, something Connor had just proved he was incapable of providing. That evening, I returned to the hospital with Connor's clean pajamas and his favorite homemade cookies. I sat beside his bed, held his hand, and listened to him talk about his recovery plans with the same loving attention I had given him for over 2 decades. He had no idea that I was already 3 steps ahead of him in a game he didn't even know we were playing. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my former business partner, Vivian Chen, who had been begging me to return to financial consulting for years. The second was to my divorce attorney, a brilliant woman named Patricia Williams who specialized in complex asset division. The third was to Connor's doctor, requesting a meeting about his care transition planning. Connor thought he was getting rid of a free maid. What he was actually losing was the financial mastermind who had quadrupled his net worth, the legal guardian who controlled his medical decisions, and the wife who had spent 23 years learning every one of his weaknesses, secrets, and vulnerabilities. But most importantly, he was losing the only person who had ever loved him enough to sacrifice everything for his well-being. And once that love died, which it had, completely and permanently, in a hospital hallway, Connor Simpson became nothing more than a business problem that needed to be solved. I had solved much more complex problems for much smarter people than my husband. This was going to be almost enjoyable. I spent that first night after the hospital revelation doing something I hadn't done in 23 years, thinking about myself. Not Connor's needs, not his medication schedule, not his comfort, just me. Christabel Morrison Simpson, the woman who had disappeared so completely into caregiving that I'd almost forgotten she existed. Our house felt different as I walked through it that night. The hospital bed that dominated our living room, the wheelchair ramps I'd had installed, the grab bars in every bathroom. All of it suddenly looked like evidence of my own imprisonment rather than symbols of my devotion. I made myself a cup of real coffee, the expensive kind Connor complained was a waste of money, and sat at my old desk in what used to be my home office. It had been converted into a storage room for medical supplies years ago, but my computer was still there, buried under boxes of adult diapers and wound care products. As I powered up the laptop for the first time in months, I caught sight of myself in the darkened window. At 66, I was still beautiful. High cheekbones that age had sharpened rather than softened, silver hair that framed my face elegantly, and eyes that held intelligence Connor had spent decades trying to dim. But there were things age couldn't hide. The slight stoop in my shoulders from years of lifting and transferring a grown man. The lines around my eyes from countless sleepless nights. The way my hands had developed a permanent tremor from stress and exhaustion. 23 years. I had given him 23 years of my life, and he called me a good-for-nothing free maid. My laptop beeped to life, and I was surprised to see that my old financial software was still installed, still connected to accounts I'd forgotten I maintained. As I scrolled through the data, a slow smile spread across my face. Connor had no idea how much money we actually had. Or rather, how much money I had made for us over the years. While he'd been focused on his physical therapy and pain management, I'd been quietly maintaining and growing our investment portfolio through automatic systems I'd set up decades ago. Our net worth was $3.2 million. Connor thought it was maybe $800,000. But that was just the beginning of what Connor didn't know. He didn't know that the house was in my name only, something I'd arranged years ago for tax purposes that he'd been too drugged and distracted to question. He didn't know that I'd been named the sole beneficiary on 3 life insurance policies worth $2.5 million combined. He didn't know that I had power of attorney over all his medical and financial decisions, paperwork he'd signed without reading during one of his more heavily medicated periods. And most importantly, he didn't know that I had been recording every conversation in our house for the past 5 years, ostensibly for medical reasons, but actually because I'd learned to document everything in case of legal challenges to his care, including the conversation I'd had with our family doctor just 6 months ago, where Connor had explicitly stated that he trusted me completely with all aspects of his care and that he never wanted to be placed in a facility under any circumstances. Christabel is the only person I trust, he'd said on tape. She's my anchor, my everything. I don't know what I'd do without her. Lies, all of it. But lies that were now legally binding statements about his mental state and his wishes for his care. I spent the next 3 hours going through every document, every account, every legal instrument that governed our shared life. By dawn, I had a complete picture of our financial situation and a growing understanding of just how much power I actually held. Connor had spent so many years seeing me as his servant that he'd forgotten I was also his wife, his business partner, and his legal guardian. He'd signed papers without reading them, trusted me with passwords and access codes, and generally treated me like a highly trained pet who would never bite the hand that fed her. He was about to learn that this particular pet had very sharp teeth. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital with Connor's breakfast, homemade oatmeal with fresh berries, exactly the way he liked it. I fed him spoonful by spoonful, listened to him complain about the physical therapist, and nodded sympathetically when he talked about how much he was looking forward to coming home. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Chris," he said, using the pet name that used to make my heart flutter. Now, it just sounded condescending. "You're my rock. I love taking care of you," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It's what wives do. Connor smiled that practiced smile. You're one in a million, sweetheart. Most women would have run by now. Most women aren't as committed as I am, I said, and I meant every word, just not the way he thought. After lunch, I excused myself to make some phone calls. Connor waved me away absently, already reaching for the television remote. I made those calls in the hospital parking lot, sitting in my sensible sedan while watching other families come and go. Families that looked tired, stressed, but still fundamentally connected. Families that hadn't been corrupted by one partner viewing the other as unpaid labor. The first call was to Vivian Chin. Christabel. Vivian's voice was surprised but delighted. It's been forever. How are you? I'm ready to come back to work, I said without preamble. And I need a favor. There was a pause. What kind of favor? I need to liquidate some assets quickly and quietly. About $2 million worth.
Jesus, Cris.
Are you in trouble? No, I said, watching a young couple help their elderly father into a car. But my husband is about to be. The second call was to Patricia Williams, the divorce attorney. Ms. Williams, my name is Christabel Simpson. I need to discuss a very complex marital dissolution. Of course, Mrs. Simpson. When would you like to come in?
Today.
And Ms. Williams? I should mention that I'm about to make my husband's life very difficult. I want to make sure everything I do is completely legal. The third call was the most important. I dialed the number for Connor's doctor, Dr. Harrison Reed. Dr. Reed, this is Christabel Simpson. I need to schedule a care conference about my husband's discharge planning. Of course, Mrs. Simpson. Is there a problem?
Not yet, I said.
But there's going to be. That afternoon, I sat in Patricia Williams' office, laying out the complete picture of my marriage. The financial complexity, the medical situation, the 23 years of unpaid caregiving, and most importantly, Connor's recent statements about having me declared mentally unstable. Patricia was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of predatory smile that made opposing counsel nervous. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes and occasionally raising her eyebrows. Mrs. Simpson, she said finally, you're not just the victim here. You're also holding all the cards. What do you mean? Your husband has essentially trapped himself. He's medically dependent on you, financially dependent on assets you control, and legally bound by documents he signed giving you complete authority over his care. If he tries to have you declared mentally unfit, he'll have to prove that his own judgment was impaired when he signed those papers. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her smile growing sharper. More importantly, if your husband is planning to abandon you after 23 years of caregiving, California law is very clear about spousal support obligations, especially when one spouse has sacrificed their career to care for the other. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want to destroy your husband financially, emotionally, and socially, you have everything you need to do it completely legally. The only question is how thorough you want to be. I thought about Connor's laugh in that hospital room, about 23 years of sacrifice dismissed as the work of a good-for-nothing free maid, about his plans to have me committed so he could replace me with paid professionals. I want to be very thorough, I said. Patricia's smile could have cut glass. Then, let's get started. That evening, I returned to the hospital with Connor's dinner and his evening medications. I sat beside his bed, held his hand, and listened to him talk about his plans for physical therapy. He had no idea that I'd already begun the process of taking back everything he'd taken from me. No idea that his free maid had spent the afternoon setting up the systematic demolition of his entire world. But he would learn soon enough. Connor Simpson wanted to treat his wife like hired help.
Fine.
But hired help could quit with 2 weeks' notice. I was giving him 24 hours. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. for the first time in years, not because Connor needed medication or repositioning, but because I had work to do. Real work. The kind that engaged my mind and challenged my abilities, the kind I'd abandoned to become a full-time caregiver. I dressed carefully in one of my old business suits, a charcoal gray Armani that still fit perfectly despite the years. As I applied makeup for the first time in months, real makeup, not just the bare minimum I managed between Connor's needs, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and felt a shock of recognition. There she was, Christabel Morrison, the woman who had commanded respect in boardrooms across the country. She'd been buried under years of domestic servitude, but she wasn't dead. She was just sleeping. And now she was awake. My first stop was the bank. Our bank, where I'd been managing our accounts for over 2 decades. The manager, James Foster, greeted me with a kind of deference reserved for clients with substantial assets. "Mrs. Simpson, how wonderful to see you. How is Connor doing?" "He's recovering," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Actually, James, I'm here to make some changes to our account structure." For the next hour, I methodically restructured our financial life. The joint accounts became individual accounts in my name only. The investment portfolios that Connor didn't even know existed were moved to a new brokerage under my sole control. The automatic payments for his medical equipment, prescriptions, and therapy sessions were canceled. "Mrs. Simpson," James said carefully, "these are rather significant changes. Shouldn't Mr. Simpson be involved in these decisions?" I smiled, the kind of smile I used to give to clients who questioned my investment strategies. "James, I have full financial power of attorney. Every change I'm making is completely legal and within my rights as Connor's spouse and designated financial guardian." I slid a folder across his desk. "Here's the documentation if you need to review it." James flipped through the papers, his expression growing more serious with each page. "These powers are quite comprehensive." "Yes, they are." Connor insisted on giving me complete control during one of his more vulnerable periods. He said he trusted me completely to act in his best interests. Which was true. What Connor hadn't considered was that my best interests and his best interests were no longer aligned. My second stop was the medical supply company that provided Connor's equipment. I walked into their office with a briefcase full of documentation and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing. "I need to discuss the account for Connor Simpson," I told the receptionist. "I'm his wife and financial guardian." 30 minutes later, I had canceled every rental agreement, every delivery service, and every ongoing contract. The hospital bed, the wheelchair, the bathroom equipment, the specialized mattress, all of it would be picked up within the week. "Ma'am," the manager said nervously, "this equipment is essential for Mr. Simpson's care. Are you sure you want to cancel everything?" "I'm quite sure," I replied. "Mr. Simpson has expressed a desire for different care arrangements. These changes reflect his wishes." My third stop was Connor's physical therapy clinic. I met with his primary therapist, an earnest young man named David who had been working with Connor for 3 years. "Mrs. Simpson, I wasn't expecting to see you today. Is Connor coming in for an extra session?" "Actually, David, I need to inform you that Connor's therapy will be ending."
Permanently.
David's face fell. "But Mrs. Simpson, Connor has been making such good progress." Stopping therapy now could set him back significantly. "I understand your concern," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the voice recording app. "But Connor has been very clear about his feelings regarding his current care situation. Would you like to hear his exact words?" I played a carefully edited version of Connor's hospital conversation, just the part where he complained about the cost and time involved in physical therapy, conveniently leaving out the context. David listened with growing confusion. "Mrs. Simpson, Connor seemed much more motivated than this just last week." "People can be very good at hiding their true feelings," I said, "especially when they don't want to hurt the people who are trying to help them." By noon, I had systematically dismantled every support system that had made Connor's life at home possible. The medical equipment was being repossessed, the therapy was canceled, the automatic prescription deliveries were stopped, and the specialized meal delivery service was terminated. But I wasn't done. Not even close. My afternoon appointment was with Vivian Chin, my former business partner, and the woman who had built our financial consulting firm into one of the most respected in California after I left to care for Connor. Christabel. Vivian embraced me warmly. You look incredible. I was starting to think I'd never see you in a business suit again. I'm ready to come back, Viv. Full-time. Vivian's eyes lit up. Seriously? What about Connor? Connor is going to be transitioning to a different care arrangement. I'll be available to start immediately. We spent 2 hours discussing my return to the firm. My clients, the ones who had waited years for me to return, my office space, my compensation package. By the time I left, I had a contract guaranteeing me $500,000 annually plus bonuses, with the possibility of partnership within 2 years. For the first time in over 2 decades, I was financially independent. More than independent, I was powerful. That evening, I returned to the hospital with Connor's dinner. He was in good spirits, chatting with Blake about discharge plans and home modifications. "There's my angel," Connor said as I entered the room. Blake was just saying how lucky I am to have such a devoted wife. The luckiest man alive, Blake agreed. Not many women would sacrifice their careers to take care of their husbands the way Christabel has. I smiled sweetly. It's been my pleasure. Though, Connor, we do need to discuss some changes for when you come home. Connor's expression grew slightly concerned. What kind of changes? Well, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about how you sometimes feel like what was the phrase? Just a free maid? Connor's face went white. Blake looked confused. I continued with the same sweet smile. I realized you're absolutely right. I have been acting more like hired help than a wife. So I've decided to make some adjustments to better reflect our actual relationship. Christabel, I never said, "Oh, but you did, darling." Yesterday afternoon, you told Blake that I was a good-for-nothing, just a free maid. You said I was useful, like having a live-in nurse who works for room and board. Blake had the decency to look embarrassed. Connor looked like he wanted to disappear into his hospital bed. Sweetheart, that's not. I was just... You were being honest, I said, my voice still perfectly pleasant. And honesty is so important in a marriage, don't you think? I reached into my purse and pulled out a small stack of papers. So I've been honest too. These are the cancellation notices for your medical equipment, your physical therapy, and your prescription delivery service. Connor's eyes widened in horror.
What?
Well, you see, Connor, all of those services were arranged and paid for by me. You're free maid. But since you've made it clear that's not the kind of relationship you want, I've decided to stop providing those services. Christabel, you can't. Oh, but I can. And I have. I pulled out another document. This is from my new employer. I start Monday morning. Full-time. Connor stared at the letterhead. Morrison and Chin Financial? But you sold your partnership years ago. I bought it back.
Today.
Turns out they were very eager to have me return. Apparently, sacrificing my career to care for you didn't make me unemployable. It just made me unavailable. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. Now, I know you're probably wondering about your care when you're discharged. The good news is, you were absolutely right about the cost of professional nursing. It is expensive. About $300 an hour for the level of care you require. Connor's mouth opened and closed silently. The bad news is, that's no longer my problem. You see, Connor, I've realized that you're absolutely right. I am just hired help. But hired help gets paid, and hired help can quit. I placed a business card on his bedside table. This is for the best private nursing agency in the city. They provide exactly the kind of professional care you deserve. You'll want to call them soon. Their waiting list is quite long. Christabel, please, you can't leave me. I need you. No, Connor. You need a caregiver. I'm going back to being a wife. And a wife who's been disrespected and devalued by her husband has every right to reconsider her priorities. I kissed his forehead gently, the way I had thousands of times before. But this time, it felt like goodbye. I'll see you at home, darling. We have so much to discuss about your future care arrangements. As I walked out of that hospital room, I heard Connor calling my name desperately. But I didn't turn around. I had spent 23 years dropping everything whenever Connor called. That woman was gone. In her place was someone Connor had never met, Christabel Morrison Simpson, the woman who had just reclaimed her life. And she was just getting started. Connor came home 3 days later to a house that looked like a medical supply warehouse having a going-out-of-business sale. The hospital bed was gone, replaced by our old queen-size bed that he couldn't transfer to independently. The wheelchair ramps had been removed, leaving him unable to navigate the steps to our bedroom or bathroom. The shower chair, grab bars, and toilet seat riser had all been returned to the medical supply company. I greeted him at the door wearing a crisp business suit and a smile that could have frozen wine. "Welcome home, darling," I said, watching the home health aide struggle to get Connor's wheelchair through the front door without the ramp. "I hope you don't mind the changes. I've been redecorating." Connor's face was a mask of barely controlled panic. "Christabel, where's the bed? The equipment? How am I supposed to?" "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss that right now," I interrupted, checking my watch. "I have a client meeting in an hour. But don't worry, I've arranged for professional care." I gestured to the home health aide, a tired-looking woman in her 50s named Margaret. "Margaret will be here until 6 p.m. After that, the overnight nurse arrives. Her name is Sandra, and she comes highly recommended." Connor's eyes widened. "How much is this costing?" "About $800 a day," I said casually. "But don't worry about the money, darling. I've moved our assets around to cover it." What I didn't tell him was that I'd moved our assets into accounts he couldn't access, and that the nursing care was being paid for with his credit cards, cards I'd had the limits increased on using my power of attorney. "Christabel, we need to talk," Connor said, his voice strained. "Of course we do. But not right now. As I mentioned, I'm going back to work. Full-time. I'm sure you understand. After 23 years of being your free maid, I need to rebuild my professional reputation." I picked up my briefcase and headed toward the door. "Oh, and Connor? I've taken the liberty of scheduling some consultations for you with long-term care facilities, just in case you decide that professional nursing is too expensive. You can't put me in a home." I paused at the door, turning back with a look of genuine confusion. "Of course I can't. That decision is entirely up to you. I'm just your wife, remember? All I can do is provide you with options and support your choices." I smiled sweetly. "After all, as you so eloquently put it, you need professional care. I'm just helping you get exactly what you wanted." The door closed behind me with a satisfying click. Through the window, I could see Connor arguing with Margaret, who looked like she was already regretting taking this assignment. My first stop was Morrison & Chin Financial, where I walked into my new office for the first time in over 20 years. The space was everything I dreamed of during those long nights of changing adult diapers and monitoring medication schedules, floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city, and the kind of respectful silence that comes from being surrounded by people who value your intelligence. "Christabel," Vivian greeted me with a stack of files. "I can't tell you how many clients have been asking when you'd be back. The Hartwell account alone has been requesting you specifically for 3 years." The Hartwell account. I remembered them. Old money, complex trusts, the kind of financial planning that required both brilliance and discretion. The kind of work that had made me feel alive in ways that measuring out Connor's medications never had. "What's their situation?" I asked, settling behind my desk and feeling power flow through me like electricity. "Family succession planning. $50 million estate, 3 generations of beneficiaries, and a patriarch who's starting to show signs of dementia. They need someone who understands both complex financial structures and family dynamics." I smiled. "Schedule a meeting for tomorrow. And Viv, make sure they know I'm back permanently." The morning flew by in a blur of client calls, investment reviews, and strategic planning sessions. For the first time in decades, I was using my mind for something other than coordinating Connor's care. It felt like emerging from underwater and finally being able to breathe. At lunch, I had a meeting that would prove crucial to my long-term plans. Dr. Harrison Reed, Connor's primary physician, had agreed to discuss Connor's care needs over coffee. "Mrs. Simpson," Dr. Reed said, settling into his chair at the upscale cafe I'd chosen. "I have to say, I was surprised by your call. Connor's always spoken so highly of your dedication to his care." "And I've been dedicated," I said, stirring my latte thoughtfully. "Perhaps too dedicated." "Dr. Reed, I need to ask you something in complete confidence. As Connor's physician, do you believe he's mentally competent to make his own care decisions?" Dr. Reed frowned. "Of course. Why do you ask?" I pulled out my phone and played a carefully edited recording of Connor's conversation with Blake, the part where he talked about manipulating me and using his medications as an excuse for poor decision-making. Dr. Reed listened with growing concern. "This is troubling. Mrs. Simpson, has Connor been making statements like this regularly?" "I'm afraid so. And lately, he's been making some very concerning financial decisions. Expensive equipment purchases, risky investments. I'm worried that his pain medications might be affecting his judgment more than we realized." "What kind of financial decisions?" I showed him documentation of the nursing care expenses, framed, of course, as Connor's choice rather than my arrangement. $800 a day for private nursing care when he has a perfectly capable wife willing to provide the same services for free. "Dr. Reed, I'm worried that Connor might be experiencing some kind of psychological break." Dr. Reed studied the paperwork with obvious concern. "Mrs. Simpson, given what you've shown me, I think Connor might benefit from a psychiatric evaluation. If his judgment is impaired, there could be serious implications for his care planning." "I was hoping you'd say that," I said. "I've been so worried, but I didn't want to seem like an overprotective wife." By the time our lunch ended, Dr. Reed had agreed to refer Connor for a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and to document his concerns about Connor's decision-making capacity in his medical records. My afternoon was spent with Patricia Williams, reviewing the next phase of my legal strategy. "Christabel," Patricia said, spreading documents across her conference table, "you've positioned yourself beautifully. Your husband is now on record as questioning your mental fitness, but his own doctor is documenting concerns about his psychological state. He's spending money at an unsustainable rate on care he doesn't actually need, and he's made statements that could be interpreted as financially manipulative. What's our next move?" "We establish a pattern of Connor making poor decisions that put his own care at risk. Document everything, every expensive nursing shift, every refusal of reasonable alternatives, every statement he makes about his care preferences." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "California law is very clear about this, Christabel. If Connor is deemed unable to make sound financial decisions regarding his care, and if his current care arrangement is unsustainable, the court can appoint a guardian to make decisions in his best interest." "And who would that guardian be?" Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. "His devoted wife, of course. The woman who sacrificed her career to care for him for 23 years. The woman who has power of attorney and an intimate understanding of his needs." "What would that mean in practical terms?" It would mean you could make all decisions about his care, his finances, and his living situation. Connor would have no legal right to refuse your choices, no matter how much he might disagree with them. I felt a surge of satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. How long would this process take? Given the documentation you've already gathered and Dr. Reed's cooperation, probably 6 to 8 weeks. The key is demonstrating that Connor's current decisions are putting him at risk, financially, medically, and emotionally. That evening, I returned home to find Connor in a state of barely controlled hysteria. The day nurse had quit after Connor screamed at her for refusing to lift him without proper equipment. The evening nurse had called in sick, leaving Connor stranded in his wheelchair with no way to transfer to bed. "Christabel, thank God you're home," Connor said, his voice desperate. "I need help getting to bed, and these idiots you hire don't know what they're doing." I set down my briefcase and looked at him with genuine sympathy. "Oh, Connor, that sounds terrible. But darling, I'm not a trained nurse. I wouldn't want to hurt you by attempting a transfer I'm not qualified to perform."
What are you talking about?
"You've been transferring me for 23 years. That was different," I said patiently. "That was when I was your free maid. Now I'm your wife, and wives shouldn't be expected to provide professional medical care." Connor's face turned red. "Stop throwing that in my face. I never meant." "What you meant and what you said are two different things," I interrupted. "And what you said was recorded on hospital security cameras, witnessed by another patient, and documented in your medical file." The color drained from Connor's face. "What?" "Oh yes, darling. Hospital hallways have excellent acoustics. Your conversation with Blake was quite audible from the nurse's station. In fact, your statements about manipulating me and using your medications as an excuse for poor judgment have been noted by your medical team." I moved closer to his wheelchair, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Dr. Reed is quite concerned about your mental state, Connor. He's referring you for a psychiatric evaluation to determine if your pain medications are affecting your cognitive function." "You bitch," Connor whispered. "You're destroying me." "No, darling," I said, straightening up with a smile. "I'm just giving you exactly what you asked for. Professional care, professional boundaries, and professional consequences for unprofessional behavior." I walked toward the stairs, then paused. "Oh, and Connor? I've scheduled your psychiatric evaluation for next week. Dr. Reed feels it's urgent, given your recent statements about financial manipulation and mental instability. Christabel, please. Sleep well, darling. I'm sure the overnight nurse will be here soon. She's from a different agency. Apparently, word is getting around about this assignment being challenging." I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, the bedroom Connor could no longer access without help, and closed the door. From downstairs, I could hear him crying. For 23 years, I had run downstairs every time Connor cried. I had soothed him, helped him, sacrificed my own needs for his comfort. Tonight, I poured myself a glass of wine and reviewed client portfolios. Connor had wanted to treat me like hired help. Now he was learning the difference between a devoted wife and professional care. The devoted wife would have come running at the sound of his tears. Professional care operated on a schedule and didn't respond to emotional manipulation. Connor was about to get a very expensive education in the value of what he'd thrown away. 3 weeks into Connor's new professional care arrangement, I received a call that made my day infinitely brighter. It was from Janet Morrison, the president of the country club where Connor and I had been members for 15 years. "Christabel, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling." Janet's voice was warm but tinged with concern. "We've been hearing some interesting stories about Connor's situation." I was in my office, reviewing investment portfolios for a tech mogul who'd made his fortune in cryptocurrency. The work was engaging, challenging, and profitable. Everything my life with Connor had not been. "What kind of stories, Janet?" "Well, Connor's been calling the club quite frequently. Apparently, he's been asking if we provide transportation services for disabled members. When we explained that we don't, he became rather agitated. I frowned, though I wasn't surprised. Connor had been making increasingly desperate phone calls as his world systematically collapsed around him. I see. Christabel, he also asked if the club could provide nursing care during social events. When we said no, he accused us of discriminating against disabled people and threatened to sue us. Now I was genuinely interested. He threatened to sue the country club? I'm afraid so. And Christabel, he also said some very unkind things about you. He claimed you'd abandoned him, that you were keeping him prisoner in his own home, and that you'd stolen his money to pay for unnecessary nursing care. I set down my pen, giving Janet my full attention. That must have been very uncomfortable for you. It was. Especially since everyone knows how devoted you've been to Connor all these years. Christabel, I have to ask, is everything all right at home? This was the opening I'd been waiting for. Janet, can I speak to you in confidence? Of course, dear. Connor's been struggling with some psychological issues related to his medications. His doctor is very concerned about his mental state. He's been making bizarre financial decisions, lashing out at caregivers, and saying things that are completely out of character. I paused for effect. I'm afraid he's having some kind of breakdown. The threats against the club are just the beginning. He's also threatened to sue his medical team, the nursing agencies, and even me. Oh my goodness, Christabel. That's terrible. The worst part is, he's been spreading these stories about me to anyone who will listen. He's called our neighbors our old friends, even my colleagues at work. He's claiming I'm abusing him, stealing from him, holding him hostage. I let my voice break slightly. Janet, I've given 23 years of my life to caring for Connor. I gave up my career, my independence, everything. And now he's trying to destroy my reputation because I've had to set some boundaries for my own sanity. Christabel, this is awful. What can we do to help? Well, if Connor continues to contact the club with threats or inappropriate requests, I hope you'll document everything. His lawyer is going to need evidence of his deteriorating mental state for the competency hearing. Competency hearing? The court is going to determine whether Connor is mentally fit to make his own decisions. Given his recent behavior, I sighed dramatically. I'm just trying to protect him from himself, Janet. But it's so hard when he fights me every step of the way. After I hung up with Janet, I made similar calls to 3 other social contacts, women who knew both Connor and me, who had influence in our community, and who would spread the story of Connor's breakdown throughout our social circle. To each one, I told the same story. Connor was having a psychological crisis, making threats and false accusations, and I was the devoted wife trying to get him the help he needed while protecting others from his increasingly erratic behavior. By the end of the week, Connor had been quietly removed from 2 charity boards and dropped from the guest list for the Riverside Hospital Foundation Gala, an event we'd attended together for 12 years. But I wasn't finished with Connor's social destruction. Not even close. My next target was Connor's weekly poker game. For 15 years, he'd played cards every Thursday night with the same group of men, successful professionals who had known Connor before his accident and who had remained loyal friends throughout his disability. I called the host, Dr. Michael Chen, and asked if I could speak with him privately. Mrs. Simpson, of course. Is everything all right with Connor? He's missed the last 2 weeks. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Michael. Connor's been having some serious health issues, mental health issues. I arranged to meet Michael for coffee the next day. He was a kind man, a radiologist who had always treated Connor with respect and dignity despite his disability, which made what I was about to do almost feel like a betrayal. Almost. Michael, I said, settling into the booth across from him, I need to tell you something in confidence. Connor's been experiencing what his doctor believes is medication-induced paranoia and delusion. Michael's face showed immediate concern. Medication-induced? That's serious.
It is.
He's been making accusations against people, terrible accusations. He's claimed that his nurses are stealing from him, that I'm holding him prisoner, that his doctors are trying to kill him. I pulled out my phone and showed Michael a recording I'd made of Connor during one of his more frustrated outbursts. With careful editing, I'd created a clip that made him sound genuinely unhinged. Jesus, Michael whispered after listening. That doesn't sound like Connor at all. It's not Connor. Not the Connor we knew. Michael, he's been making threats against people, including you and the other poker players. What kind of threats? He's convinced that you're all conspiring against him somehow. Last week, he accused you of deliberately losing to him over the years because you felt sorry for him. He said it was humiliating and that he was going to make you all pay for pitying him. Michael looked stunned. But Connor loves poker night. It's one of his favorite things. I know. But Michael, he's not safe to be around right now. His doctor has him scheduled for a psychiatric evaluation, but until then, I shrugged helplessly. I can't let him put you and the others at risk. At risk of what? I don't know. And that's what scares me. Connor's been talking about having nothing left to lose, about how everyone has betrayed him. Michael, I'm genuinely worried about what he might do. By the time our coffee was finished, Michael had agreed to suspend Connor from poker night indefinitely. More importantly, he'd agreed to warn the other players about Connor's mental health crisis and his potential for unpredictable behavior. Within days, Connor's phone stopped ringing. The men who had faithfully included him in their weekly tradition for over a decade now saw him as a potential threat rather than a friend. But my masterpiece was yet to come. Connor had one thing left that gave him a sense of purpose and identity: his volunteer work with the Spinal Cord Injury Foundation. For 8 years, he had been their most visible spokesperson, speaking at fundraisers and support groups, sharing his story of overcoming adversity with newly injured patients. It was the one area of his life where he felt valuable, respected, and needed, which made it the perfect target for my final social assault. I called the foundation's director, Linda Santos, and requested a meeting about Connor's ongoing involvement with the organization. Mrs. Simpson, Connor is one of our most valued volunteers, Linda said as we sat in her office. His work with newly injured patients has been absolutely transformational. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you, Linda. I'm concerned that Connor's current mental state might make him inappropriate for patient contact. Linda's expression grew serious. What do you mean? Connor's been experiencing some psychological issues related to his medications. His doctor is evaluating him for possible cognitive impairment and paranoid ideation. I handed Linda a folder containing Connor's recent medical notes that, with Dr. Reed's cooperation, painted a picture of a man struggling with medication-induced mental health issues. Linda, Connor's been making inappropriate statements about his care, about me, about the medical profession in general. He's accused multiple healthcare providers of incompetence or malicious intent. I'm worried that these delusions might extend to his interactions with patients. That's very concerning, Christabel. It is. And Linda, I have to tell you something in confidence. Connor's been talking about the foundation in ways that worry me. He's convinced that the organization is somehow exploiting disabled people for fundraising purposes. Linda's eyes widened. That's not true at all. I know that, and you know that, but Connor doesn't see it that way anymore. He's been talking about exposing the foundation, about how disabled people are being used as inspiration porn for wealthy donors. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a concerned whisper. Linda, he's mentioned wanting to disrupt the next fundraising gala. He said something about making a speech that would tell the truth about how disabled people are really treated. Oh my God. Christabel, we can't have someone making accusations like that at a public event. It would destroy our credibility. I know. That's why I wanted to warn you. Connor's not himself right now, Linda. The man you knew, the inspirational speaker who helps so many people, he's been replaced by someone who sees conspiracies and exploitation everywhere. Within a week, Connor received a letter from the Spinal Cord Injury Foundation expressing their appreciation for his years of service and informing him that they were restructuring their volunteer program. His speaking engagements were canceled, his access to patient support groups was revoked, and his honorary board position was quietly eliminated. Connor called me at work, crying. It was the first time in 3 weeks that he'd called me directly instead of screaming at whatever nurse happened to be on duty. Christabel, they fired me. The foundation, they said they don't need me anymore. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. Connor's work with the foundation had been genuinely meaningful, one of the few things that had given him dignity and purpose during his darkest years. But then I remembered him calling me a good-for-nothing free maid. I remembered his plans to have me declared mentally unstable. I remembered 23 years of my life sacrificed for a man who saw me as nothing more than unpaid labor. I'm sorry to hear that, Connor, I said, my voice professionally sympathetic. But, sometimes when we're going through mental health challenges, it affects all areas of our lives. I'm not having mental health challenges.
I've fine.
Of course you are, darling. But perception is reality, isn't it? And right now, people are perceiving you as someone who might not be stable. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Connor, I continued gently, maybe this is a sign that you should focus on getting better, on accepting help instead of fighting everyone who's trying to care for you. I want you to come home, he whispered. I want things to go back to the way they were. Oh, Connor, I said, and for a moment my voice held genuine sadness. They can't go back. You made sure of that when you decided I was nothing but a free maid. I hung up the phone and returned to my work. Outside my office window, the city sparkled in the afternoon sunshine. Somewhere in that city, Connor was sitting alone in his wheelchair, abandoned by his friends, rejected by his volunteer organization, and cared for by a rotating cast of professional nurses who saw him as nothing more than a difficult patient. 23 years ago, I would have dropped everything to comfort him. I would have driven home immediately, held him while he cried, and promised him that everything would be all right. But that woman was gone. In her place was someone Connor had created through years of taking me for granted, someone who understood that love without respect was just exploitation in disguise. Connor had wanted to treat me like hired help. Now he was learning what it felt like when even hired help wouldn't stay. The psychiatric evaluation results arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after Connor's return from the hospital. I was in my office, conducting a video conference with clients in Tokyo, when Patricia Williams called with the news I'd been waiting for. Christabel, we have the report. Dr. Elizabeth Foster completed Connor's comprehensive evaluation yesterday. I muted my video call, my heart racing with anticipation. And Connor has been diagnosed with adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressive features, likely exacerbated by chronic pain medication use. More importantly, Dr. Foster has serious concerns about his decision-making capacity, particularly regarding financial matters. I felt a surge of triumph that I carefully kept out of my voice. What exactly did she find? Connor demonstrated poor impulse control, unrealistic expectations about his care needs, and what Dr. Foster described as financial delusions of grandeur. He apparently told her that he could afford unlimited private nursing care and that money was no object for his comfort. This was perfect. Connor's arrogance had finally worked against him. The report also notes his paranoid ideation regarding family members and caregivers, his threats against multiple healthcare providers, and his inappropriate sexual comments about female nurses. I paused. Sexual comments? Apparently, Connor made several remarks to Dr. Foster about how his private nurses were younger and prettier than his wife, and how he deserved to be cared for by attractive women after years of sacrifice. The irony was breathtaking. Connor, who had spent decades being cared for by a devoted wife, was now fantasizing about attractive young nurses while simultaneously destroying his marriage. Patricia, what does this mean for the guardianship petition? It means we have everything we need. Connor has been deemed mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, and potentially dangerous to caregivers. The court will almost certainly grant you full guardianship. When? The hearing is scheduled for next week. Christabel, once this goes through, you'll have complete control over Connor's medical care, financial decisions, and living arrangements. He'll essentially become a ward of the state, with you as his appointed guardian. After I hung up with Patricia, I sat in my office chair, staring out at the city below. In 1 week, I would have legal authority over every aspect of Connor's life. The same authority he had once wielded over mine, except I would be using it to protect myself rather than exploit him. But first, I had one more financial surprise for my dear husband. That evening, I came home to find Connor in the living room with his evening nurse, Sandra, a competent woman in her 40s who had lasted longer than most because she refused to engage with Connor's complaints and inappropriate comments. "How was your day, darling?" I asked, settling into the chair across from Connor's wheelchair. "Terrible," Connor replied. "Sandra won't help me with my shower because she says it's not in her scope of practice. These nurses you've hired are useless." "I'm sorry to hear that. But Connor, I have some good news. I had a meeting with our financial advisor today about our long-term care planning." Connor's expression grew suspicious. "What kind of planning?" I pulled out a folder thick with financial documents. "Well, as you know, we've been spending about $800 a day on your nursing care. That's roughly $24,000 a month, or $288,000 annually." Connor's face went pale. "That much?" "Oh, yes. And that's just the basic care. If you need specialized equipment, additional therapy, or medical interventions, the costs could easily double." I spread the papers across the coffee table between us. "So, I've been looking at our assets to determine how long we can sustain this level of expenditure. And, well, the good news is that we have substantial savings. The bad news is that at the current rate of spending, we'll be bankrupt within 18 months. Connor stared at the numbers, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Of course," I continued casually, "there are alternatives. We could reduce the level of care, eliminate some services, or consider a long-term care facility. I'm not going to a nursing home. Of course not. That's why I've been exploring other options." I pulled out another set of documents. "For instance, we could sell the house and use the proceeds to fund your care." Connor's eyes widened in horror. "Sell the house? This is my home." "Well, technically it's our home. But since you require specialized care that can't be provided in a traditional residential setting, it makes sense to liquidate this asset and find you a more appropriate living situation." "Christabel, you can't sell our house." I looked at him with genuine confusion. "Connor, I thought you wanted professional care." "Professional care requires professional facilities. You can't have both a private home and institutional-level nursing care." Sandra, who had been quietly organizing Connor's medications, looked up with interest. Even she seemed to understand the trap Connor had walked into. "But where would I live?" Connor asked desperately. "There are several excellent assisted living facilities in the area. They provide exactly the kind of comprehensive care you've been demanding: 24-hour nursing, physical therapy, specialized equipment, medical supervision. Those places are for old people. Connor, you're 68 years old. You require total care assistance, and you've been deemed mentally unstable by a psychiatric professional. You are exactly the demographic those facilities serve." I gathered up the papers, my voice taking on the brisk efficiency I used with difficult clients. "But don't worry, you won't have to make these decisions alone. I've petitioned the court to appoint a legal guardian who can help you navigate these complex choices. What kind of guardian? Someone who understands your care needs, your financial situation, and your best interests. Someone who's been involved in your care for years and who has the legal authority to make decisions when you're not capable of making them yourself. Connor's face went white as understanding dawned. You're trying to get guardianship over me. I'm trying to protect you from yourself, Connor. You've been making dangerous and expensive decisions that put your health and financial security at risk. Someone needs to step in before you destroy what's left of your life. I won't let you do this. Connor, it's not up to you anymore. Dr. Foster's psychiatric evaluation clearly states that you lack the capacity to make sound financial and medical decisions. The court has already reviewed her findings. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. The hearing is next week. I suggest you get a good lawyer, though I should mention that legal fees will come out of your personal assets, which are currently being depleted at an alarming rate by your nursing care. Connor called after me as I headed upstairs, his voice cracking with desperation. Christabel, please. You're destroying me. I paused on the stairs, looking down at the man who had spent 23 years taking my devotion for granted.
No, Connor.
I'm giving you exactly what you asked for. You wanted professional care instead of a free maid. You wanted to be treated like a patient instead of a husband. You wanted boundaries instead of unconditional love. I continued up the stairs, my voice carrying clearly through the house. Congratulations, darling. You're about to get everything you ever wanted. The next morning, I met with my financial advisor, James Peterson, to discuss the final phase of my plan. James had been managing our portfolio for over a decade, and he understood the complexities of Connor's situation. Christabel, I have to say, the guardianship arrangement will actually simplify your financial planning considerably. How so? Well, once you have legal authority over Connor's care decisions, you can make more cost-effective choices about his treatment. The current nursing arrangement is unsustainable, but there are alternatives that would provide adequate care at a fraction of the cost. James pulled up a spreadsheet on his computer. For instance, a quality nursing facility would cost about $8,000 a month instead of $24,000. That's still a significant expense, but it's manageable within your current asset structure. And if Connor objects to the facility placement, that's the beauty of guardianship, Christabel. Connor's preferences become legally irrelevant. You'll have the authority to make decisions based on his best interests and your financial reality, regardless of his personal feelings about those decisions. James leaned back in his chair. Essentially, Connor will become like a child in the eyes of the law. He'll have no legal right to refuse your choices about his care, his living situation, or his financial resources. That afternoon, I received a call from Connor's hastily hired attorney, a nervous young man named David Walsh, who clearly didn't understand what he was walking into. Mrs. Simpson, I'm representing your husband in the guardianship hearing. I was hoping we could discuss a possible resolution that would avoid court proceedings. What kind of resolution, Mr. Walsh? Well, Connor is willing to acknowledge that he may have been hasty in his care decisions. He's prepared to return to the previous arrangement, with you providing his primary care in exchange for dropping the guardianship petition. I actually laughed, at the audacity of the proposal. Mr. Walsh, let me make sure I understand. Connor wants me to resume 24-hour caregiving duties, give up my career again, and pretend that the last 2 months never happened. He recognizes that there were some communication issues in the past. Communication issues, I repeated. Is that what we're calling it when a husband refers to his wife as a good-for-nothing free maid? There was silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Walsh, I think you should know that Connor's offer is not only rejected, it's insulting. I am no longer available to provide unpaid nursing care to a man who views me as domestic help. Mrs. Simpson, surely there's some middle ground. There is. Connor can accept professional care in a professional facility, funded by his own assets, under the supervision of a court-appointed guardian. That middle ground is called reality. Mrs. Simpson, if you proceed with this guardianship, you'll essentially be making Connor a prisoner. No, Mr. Walsh. For 23 years, Connor made me a prisoner. Now I'm simply returning the favor. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. By then, Connor would learn what it felt like to have someone else control every aspect of his existence. The difference was I intended to use that power to protect myself rather than exploit him. Connor had spent decades treating me like his property. Soon, he would legally become mine. The morning of the guardianship hearing, I dressed with the same care I'd once reserved for major client presentations. A navy Chanel suit, pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, and the kind of understated confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the winning cards. Connor arrived at the courthouse in a transport wheelchair, accompanied by David Walsh, and looking like a man who had finally grasped the gravity of his situation. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom, and his hands shook slightly, whether from medication or fear. I couldn't tell. Judge Margaret Thompson was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variety of family dysfunction imaginable. She reviewed the case files with methodical precision before calling the hearing to order. This is a petition for guardianship of Connor Simpson, filed by his wife, Christabel Simpson. Mr. Walsh, you're representing the proposed ward. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Simpson contests this petition and maintains that he is fully capable of making his own decisions. Judge Thompson looked at Connor over her reading glasses. Mr. Simpson, you understand that your wife is seeking legal authority over your medical care, financial decisions, and living arrangements? Connor's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. And you object to this arrangement? Yes, Your Honor. I don't need a guardian. I can take care of myself. Judge Thompson made a note, then turned to Patricia Williams. Counselor, please present your case. Patricia stood with the kind of predatory grace that made opposing attorneys nervous. Your Honor, Connor Simpson has demonstrated a clear pattern of decision-making that puts his health, safety, and financial security at risk. She gestured to a thick folder of documentation. Over the past 2 months, Mr. Simpson has insisted on private nursing care that costs $24,000 per month despite having a qualified caregiver. His wife, available to provide the same services at no cost. What was Mr. Simpson's reasoning for this preference? According to psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Elizabeth Foster, Mr. Simpson stated that he preferred young, attractive nurses over his wife, whom he described as old and used up. He also expressed the belief that he deserved the best care money could buy, regardless of cost. Judge Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. Dr. Foster found these statements concerning? Dr. Foster diagnosed Mr. Simpson with adjustment disorder and documented significant concerns about his financial judgment and decision-making capacity. Her report notes that Mr. Simpson appears to believe he has unlimited financial resources and has made statements suggesting he views his wife as domestic help rather than a spouse. Patricia produced the psychiatric report. Mr. Simpson also made threats against healthcare providers, accused his wife of theft and abuse, and expressed paranoid ideation about his medical care. Mr. Walsh, how does your client respond to these allegations? David Walsh stood nervously. Your Honor, Mr. Simpson maintains that his wife has been manipulating his care situation to justify this guardianship petition. He claims that Mrs. Simpson deliberately created circumstances that made him appear unstable. What evidence do you have of this manipulation? Well, Mr. Simpson believes that his wife has been deliberately removing his medical equipment and coordinating with his doctors to make him seem incompetent. Judge Thompson looked skeptical. Mr. Walsh, do you have any documentation to support these claims? Mr. Simpson's recollection of events differs from what's been reported, Your Honor. Mr. Simpson's recollection versus medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and documented statements? Judge Thompson's tone suggested she found Walsh's argument less than compelling. Patricia stood again. Your Honor, if I may address Mr. Simpson's claims of manipulation? Proceed. Mrs. Simpson has provided her husband with exactly what he requested, professional nursing care. When Mr. Simpson complained that his wife was just a free maid, Mrs. Simpson arranged for him to receive paid professional services. Patricia pulled out audio recordings and transcripts. These recordings, made in a hospital setting with multiple witnesses, clearly show Mr. Simpson expressing contempt for his wife's caregiving and stating his preference for professional alternatives. Furthermore, Patricia continued, Mrs. Simpson has been funding this expensive care arrangement using marital assets, demonstrating her commitment to providing her husband with the care he demanded. Judge Thompson reviewed the audio transcripts. Mr. Simpson, did you make the statements attributed to you in these recordings? Connor's face flushed red. I was in pain. I wasn't thinking clearly. According to the medical records, you were lucid and oriented during this conversation. Dr. Reed's notes indicate that you were mentally competent when you made these statements about your wife. Your Honor, David Walsh interjected desperately. My client was expressing frustration, not making considered decisions about his care. Mr. Walsh, your client expressed clear preferences about his care arrangement and made specific statements about his relationship with his wife. Mrs. Simpson then provided exactly what he requested. Are you arguing that she should have ignored his explicitly stated wishes? Walsh had no response to that. Patricia stepped forward for the final blow. Your Honor, Mrs. Simpson has documentation showing that Mr. Simpson's current care arrangement is financially unsustainable. At the current rate of expenditure, the couple will exhaust their savings within 18 months. She produced financial projections that painted a stark picture. Mrs. Simpson is seeking guardianship to protect both her husband's health and their mutual financial security. She's prepared to arrange appropriate, cost-effective care in a facility that specializes in Mr. Simpson's needs. What kind of facility? Riverside Manor, a licensed assisted living facility with specialized services for individuals with spinal cord injuries. The cost would be approximately $8,000 per month instead of the current $24,000, and Mr. Simpson would receive comprehensive care from trained professionals. Judge Thompson turned to Connor. Mr. Simpson, what is your objection to this arrangement? Connor's voice cracked. I don't want to live in a nursing home. I want to stay in my house with my wife taking care of me. But you told multiple people that your wife was inadequate as a caregiver, that you preferred professional nurses, and that you viewed her as domestic help rather than a spouse. I didn't mean, Mr. Simpson, you can't have it both ways. Either you require professional care, in which case a professional facility makes sense, or you're satisfied with family care, in which case your previous statements about your wife were inappropriate and hurtful. Judge Thompson set down the files and looked directly at Connor. Mr. Simpson, based on the evidence presented, I'm concerned about your ability to make consistent, rational decisions about your care. She turned to me. Mrs. Simpson, if granted guardianship, what would be your plan for your husband's care? I stood, my voice clear and confident. Your Honor, I would arrange for Mr. Simpson to receive appropriate care at Riverside Manor, where he would have access to physical therapy, medical supervision, and the professional nursing care he has repeatedly stated he prefers. And what about your role in his care? I would visit regularly and ensure that his needs are met, but I would no longer serve as his primary caregiver. Mr. Simpson has made it clear that he views such arrangements as beneath his dignity. Judge Thompson nodded slowly. Mrs. Simpson, you've provided care for your husband for 23 years, sacrificing your career and personal autonomy. Is there any possibility of resuming that arrangement? I felt a moment of genuine sadness, not for Connor, but for the years I'd lost believing that love meant self-sacrifice. Your Honor, trust is the foundation of any caregiving relationship. When my husband described me as good for nothing, just a free maid, he destroyed that trust permanently. I can no longer provide intimate personal care to someone who views me with such contempt. I understand completely. Judge Thompson made her final notes, then looked up at the courtroom. Based on the psychiatric evaluation, the financial documentation, and Mr. Simpson's own statements about his care preferences, this court finds that Connor Simpson lacks the capacity to make sound decisions regarding his medical care and financial resources. Connor's face went white. Therefore, I'm granting the petition for guardianship. Christabel Simpson is hereby appointed as legal guardian for Connor Simpson, with full authority over his medical care, financial decisions, and living arrangements. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like the closing of a door, the final door between my old life and my new one. Connor collapsed in his wheelchair, sobbing. David Walsh looked like he wanted to disappear. Patricia Williams smiled with professional satisfaction. And I felt free. For the first time in 23 years, I was legally empowered to make decisions based on my own best interests instead of sacrificing everything for a man who valued me as nothing more than unpaid labor. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to arrange for Mr. Simpson's transfer to Riverside Manor as soon as possible. Given his current care expenses, every day of delay represents significant financial burden. Granted. Mrs. Simpson, you have full authority to make those arrangements immediately. As Connor was wheeled out of the courtroom, still sobbing, he turned to look at me one last time. Christabel, please.
I'm sorry.
I didn't mean any of it. I looked at the man who had been my husband for over 2 decades, who had taken my youth, my career, and my independence while calling me a good-for-nothing free maid, who had planned to have me declared mentally unstable so he could dispose of me like worn-out furniture. I know you're sorry, Connor, I said quietly. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry there were consequences. But you're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry it didn't work. I walked past his wheelchair, without another word. Behind me, I could hear him calling my name, begging, pleading. The same voice that had once asked me to fetch his medications, adjust his pillows, sacrifice my dreams for his comfort. But I didn't turn around. I had given Connor Simpson 23 years of my life. He wouldn't get another minute. Riverside Manor was exactly what Connor deserved, a sterile, institutional facility that smelled of disinfectant and despair. I toured it 3 days after the guardianship hearing, accompanied by the facility director, a middle-aged woman named Helen Brooks who had the brisk efficiency of someone who dealt with difficult families every day. Mr. Simpson will be in our memory care wing, Helen explained as we walked down corridors lined with elderly residents in wheelchairs. Given his psychiatric evaluation and the court's concerns about his judgment, we feel that environment will be most appropriate. The memory care wing was locked, designed for patients with dementia and other cognitive impairments. Residents couldn't leave without staff permission, visitors were monitored, and every activity was supervised. This seems perfect, I said, watching an elderly man trying unsuccessfully to convince a nurse to let him call his daughter. Connor will have the professional care he wanted, plus the security of knowing he can't make any poor decisions. We do have some concerns about Mr. Simpson's adjustment, Helen said carefully. Patients with spinal cord injuries who are placed here against their wishes sometimes experience significant depression. Connor has already been diagnosed with adjustment disorder and depression, I replied. I'm sure your staff is equipped to handle those issues. Helen showed me Connor's room, a small space with a hospital bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto a concrete courtyard. It was clean, functional, and utterly devoid of personality. Mr. Simpson will have access to physical therapy twice a week, occupational therapy as needed, and group activities designed for his cognitive level. What cognitive level is that? Given his documented decision-making impairments, we'll start him in our basic adult program. Bingo, simple crafts, music therapy, activities appropriate for his mental capacity. I smiled. Connor, who had once been a successful engineer, would be spending his days playing bingo with dementia patients and gluing popsicle sticks together. When can he be admitted? We can take him as early as tomorrow, if you'd like to arrange transport. That evening, I returned home to find Connor in a state of complete panic. The nursing agency had informed him that his care would be ending, and he'd spent the day calling everyone he could think of to find alternative arrangements. "Christabel, thank God you're home," Connor said, his voice desperate. "The nurses say they're not coming back. What's happening?" I set down my briefcase and looked at him with calm detachment. "I've arranged for your transfer to a care facility, Connor. You'll be admitted to Riverside Manor tomorrow morning."
What? No.
"I won't go to a nursing home. It's not a nursing home, Connor. It's an assisted living facility with specialized care for people with your challenges." "What challenges? I'm not mentally impaired." The court disagreed. Judge Thompson found that you lack the capacity to make sound decisions about your care and finances. So, I'm making those decisions for you now. Connor's face turned red with rage. "You can't do this to me. I have rights." "You had rights, Connor. You gave them up when you decided I was nothing but a free maid. Now I'm giving you exactly what you wanted: professional care from people who see you as nothing more than a patient." I walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd once tended while Connor napped in the afternoons. "The transport will be here at 9 a.m. I suggest you think about what personal items you'd like to take with you." "Personal items? What do you mean?" "Connor, you're moving to a care facility. You can bring some clothes, maybe a few books or photos. The room is quite small, so you'll need to be selective." "Room? What room? I'm not going anywhere." I turned back to him, my voice taking on the patient tone I might use with a confused child. "Connor, you don't have a choice. I'm your legal guardian now, which means I decide where you live, what care you receive, and how your money is spent. This is kidnapping."
No, Connor.
"This is consequences. For 23 years, you made decisions about my life without consulting me. You decided I would give up my career. You decided I would provide 24-hour care. You decided I would sacrifice my independence for your comfort." I moved closer to his wheelchair. "Now I'm making decisions about your life. I've decided you need professional care. I've decided you can't live independently. I've decided your current arrangement is too expensive and unsustainable. Christabel, please. I'll do anything. I'll apologize publicly. I'll pay you for your care. Connor, what could you possibly pay me? You called me a good-for-nothing free maid. Maids get minimum wage. For 23 years of round-the-clock care, that would be approximately $1.2 million. Connor's mouth fell open. "But even if you had that money, which you don't, since I control all the finances now, it wouldn't matter. Because I'm no longer available for hire as your caregiver." I walked toward the stairs, then paused. "Oh, and Connor? Riverside Manor has visiting hours on Sundays from 2 to 4 p.m. I'll try to stop by when my schedule permits." The next morning, I watched from my office window as the medical transport van pulled away from our house with Connor inside. He was strapped to a gurney, still protesting, still demanding to speak to a lawyer, still refusing to accept that his world had changed forever. I felt no satisfaction watching him go, just a profound sense of completion. For over 2 decades, my life had revolved around Connor's needs, Connor's comfort, Connor's demands. Now, for the first time since I was 43 years old, I was alone. The house felt different without the constant hum of medical equipment, The regular visits from healthcare providers, the endless cycle of medications and transfers and therapy schedules. It felt peaceful. Empty, but peaceful. I spent the afternoon removing the last traces of Connor's medical needs from our home. The grab bars in the bathroom, the ramps at the front door, the reinforced toilet seat, all of it was donated to a medical charity. By evening, the house looked like a normal home again instead of a private hospital. That night, I cooked dinner for one for the first time in 23 years. A simple pasta dish with wine and fresh herbs, eaten at the kitchen table while I read a financial journal instead of monitoring Connor's vital signs. It was the most peaceful meal I'd had in decades. 2 days later, I received a call from Helen Brooks at Riverside Manor. "Mrs. Simpson, I wanted to update you on your husband's adjustment." "How is he settling in?" "Well, there have been some challenges. Mr. Simpson has been very agitated, demanding to speak with administrators, threatening to sue the facility. He's also been making inappropriate comments to female staff members." I wasn't surprised. "What kind of inappropriate comments?" "Sexual remarks, mostly. He told one of our nurses that she was much prettier than his wife and asked if she provided special services for patients. We've had to assign only male caregivers to his room." "I see. How are you handling his agitation?" "His psychiatrist has recommended adjusting his medications to help with the behavioral issues. With your permission as guardian, we'd like to increase his anxiety medication and add a mild sedative to help him adjust." "You have my permission. Please do whatever you feel is medically necessary to help Connor adapt to his new environment." "Thank you, Mrs. Simpson. Oh, and one more thing, Mr. Simpson has been asking to call you repeatedly. He seems quite distressed about not being able to reach you. I'm not available for phone calls during his adjustment period. Please note in his file that all communication should go through his care team." "Of course. Will you be visiting this Sunday?" I looked at my calendar, which was filled with client meetings, business dinners, and social engagements I'd been invited to now that I was no longer tied to Connor's care schedule. "I don't think so. Please let Connor know that I'm very busy with work commitments." After I hung up, I sat in my home office, the room that had been Connor's recovery space for so many years and was now restored to its original purpose. My computer screen showed stock portfolios, investment strategies, and client communications. My desk was covered with the kind of complex financial planning that had once been my passion and was now my livelihood again. For the first time since Connor's accident, I was exactly where I belonged, not in a sick room managing someone else's decline, but in a place of power, using my intelligence and expertise to build something meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text message from Vivian Chin. "Client dinner tonight at 8 p.m. The Morrison account wants to discuss their estate planning. This could be huge for us." I smiled and texted back, "I'll be there. Thank you for including me." Inclusion. It was a foreign concept after years of being excluded from my own life, my own career, my own dreams. But now I was included again in business discussions, social events, professional opportunities. I was no longer Connor Simpson's free maid. I was Christabel Morrison Simpson, financial advisor, guardian, and the woman who had finally learned that love without respect was just another form of slavery. Connor was exactly where he belonged too, in a place where his needs were met by people who were paid to tolerate his behavior, who saw him as a case number rather than a husband, who would provide professional care without emotional investment. He had wanted professional boundaries. Now he had them, permanently and completely. Some lessons, I reflected, were too important to learn gently. 6 months after Connor's admission to Riverside Manor, I was living a life I'd forgotten was possible. My investment portfolio had grown by 15% under my direct management. I'd been promoted to senior partner at Morrison and Chin Financial, and I'd been featured on the cover of Financial Women magazine for the second time in my career, this time with the headline, "The Phoenix Returns, Christabel Simpson's Remarkable Career Comeback." The article, which I kept framed in my office, told the story of a successful financial advisor who had sacrificed everything to care for her disabled husband, only to return to the industry stronger and more determined than ever. It painted me as an inspiration to women everywhere who had lost themselves in caregiving roles. What it didn't mention was that Connor Simpson was now a heavily medicated patient in a memory care facility, spending his days in group therapy sessions designed for people with dementia and cognitive impairment. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office when Helen Brooks called with what she clearly thought was concerning news. "Mrs. Simpson, I wanted to discuss your husband's condition with you. Over the past month, he's shown significant cognitive decline." I set down my pen, giving her my attention. "What kind of decline?" "Confusion, disorientation, difficulty remembering recent events. His psychiatrist believes it may be related to the combination of medications we're using to manage his behavioral issues, but there could be other factors, such as depression, social isolation, the stress of institutional living. Mrs. Simpson, Connor hasn't had a visitor in over 4 months. He asks about you every day." I felt no sympathy whatsoever. "Helen, Connor is receiving exactly the care he requested. Professional, institutional care from people who see him as a patient rather than a family member." "But Mrs. Simpson, human connection is important for psychological well-being. Even a brief visit." "Helen, I spend 60 hours a week building my career after 23 years of providing unpaid care to an ungrateful man who called me a good-for-nothing free maid. I don't have time for social visits to someone who viewed our marriage as an employment arrangement." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Furthermore," I continued, "Connor specifically stated his preference for professional care over family involvement. I'm simply respecting his wishes." "Mrs. Simpson, I don't think he understood the full implications." "Helen, Connor is an intelligent man who made informed choices about his care preferences. If he's experiencing regret about those choices, that's a natural consequence of poor decision-making, not a medical emergency." After I hung up, I returned to my work. I had 3 major client presentations that week, a new business proposal to review, and a speaking engagement at a financial planning conference in Chicago. My calendar was full of meaningful, profitable activities that engaged my intellect and utilized my skills. I didn't have time to visit a man who had systematically destroyed our marriage through years of taking me for granted. That evening, I attended a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital Foundation, the kind of elegant social event I'd been excluded from for decades while Connor monopolized my time with his needs. I wore a silver Vera Wang gown that cost more than Connor's monthly care facility fees and mingled with successful professionals who treated me as an equal rather than domestic help. Christabel. Janet Morrison, the country club president, embraced me warmly. "You look absolutely radiant. How are you enjoying your return to the financial world?" "It's been wonderful, Janet. I'd forgotten how much I missed using my mind for something other than medication schedules." "And how is Connor adjusting to his new care arrangement?" I smiled serenely. "Connor is receiving exactly the level of professional care he always wanted. He's in an excellent facility with trained staff who meet all his medical needs." "That must be such a relief for you, knowing he's getting proper care." "It is. For the first time in over 20 years, I can focus on my own career without worrying about Connor's constant needs." What I didn't mention was that Connor's constant needs now included anti-anxiety medication to stop him from crying for his wife, sedatives to manage his agitation about his living situation, and antidepressants to treat the psychological breakdown he'd experienced after realizing that his comfortable life with devoted caregiving was never coming back. The next morning brought news that would complete my satisfaction with Connor's situation. David Walsh, Connor's attorney, called to inform me that Connor wanted to discuss a legal matter. "Mrs. Simpson, your husband would like to modify the guardianship arrangement." "In what way?" He's prepared to sign over complete control of all his assets to you in exchange for being allowed to return home with professional nursing care. I laughed, actually laughed, at the audacity of the proposal. Mr. Walsh, let me understand this correctly. Connor wants to give me everything he owns in exchange for me resuming responsibility for his care? He recognizes that his previous statements were inappropriate. He's prepared to compensate you for your years of unpaid caregiving. How much compensation is he offering? Complete transfer of all marital assets. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, everything. I considered this for a moment. Connor was essentially offering to pay me millions of dollars to become his caregiver again, the same job he'd once dismissed as the work of a good-for-nothing free maid. Mr. Walsh, please convey to Connor that his offer is rejected. Mrs. Simpson, surely there's some arrangement. Mr. Walsh, Connor had 23 years to appreciate what he had. He chose to view me as domestic help rather than a devoted spouse. He planned to have me declared mentally unstable so he could replace me with paid professionals. I paused, letting the weight of Connor's betrayal settle in the silence. Now he has exactly what he wanted, paid professionals providing his care. The only difference is that he's the one paying for it, and he's the one who can't leave when he gets tired of the arrangement. Mrs. Simpson, Connor is deteriorating rapidly in that facility. The isolation, the institutional setting, is exactly what he chose when he decided his wife wasn't good enough to care for him. Mr. Walsh, please note in your records that I am not available to resume caregiving responsibilities under any circumstances, regardless of compensation offered. 6 weeks later, I received a call that brought my revenge to its ultimate conclusion.
Dr.
Harrison Reed, Connor's physician, called with news about Connor's condition. Mrs. Simpson, I'm afraid Connor has experienced a significant psychological breakdown. He's been hospitalized for severe depression and is currently under psychiatric observation. What happened? Complete emotional collapse. He's been refusing to eat, won't participate in therapy, spends most of his time crying and asking for you. Mrs. Simpson, I've never seen someone deteriorate this rapidly from purely psychological causes. I felt a moment of something that might have been sympathy, followed immediately by the memory of Connor's voice in that hospital hallway. She's nothing but a free maid. Dr. Reed, what are you recommending for his treatment? Long-term psychiatric care, possibly in a locked facility. Connor has expressed suicidal ideation and may need constant supervision. Then please arrange whatever care you feel is appropriate. As his guardian, I authorize any treatment necessary for his safety. Mrs. Simpson, I have to ask, would you consider visiting him? Sometimes seeing a familiar face can help patients in these situations. I looked out my office window at the city where I'd rebuilt my career, my independence, and my sense of self-worth. Dr. Reed, Connor made it very clear that he preferred professional care to family involvement. I'm simply respecting his wishes. After the call ended, I sat in my office, surrounded by the evidence of my professional resurrection. Client files, investment reports, speaking invitations, business awards, all the things I'd given up to care for a man who had valued me as nothing more than unpaid labor. Connor Simpson had called me a good-for-nothing free maid and planned to dispose of me when I was no longer useful. Now he was learning what it felt like to be discarded by someone who held all the power in the relationship. The difference was, when Connor discarded me, I fought back and rebuilt my life into something stronger and more successful than ever. When I discarded him, he simply collapsed. My phone buzzed with a message from a new client, a tech entrepreneur who wanted me to manage a $50 million portfolio. The kind of opportunity that would never have been possible if I'd remained Connor's unpaid caregiver. I smiled and typed back, I'll clear my calendar. When would you like to meet? Connor had spent 23 years teaching me that I was worthless, that my dreams didn't matter, that my only value was in serving his needs. Now I was worth $3 million personally, managed over $200 million in client assets, and was respected as one of the top financial advisors on the West Coast. Meanwhile, Connor was in a psychiatric facility, medicated into compliance, crying for a wife who would never again sacrifice her dignity for his comfort. He had wanted to treat me like hired help. Instead, he taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that love without respect is just another form of slavery, and that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away from people who refuse to value what you give them. Connor Simpson had destroyed our marriage the day he called me a good-for-nothing free maid. I had simply been systematic about making sure he understood the consequences. 2 years later, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse office, watching the Pacific sunset paint the San Francisco Bay in shades of gold and crimson. Below me, the city hummed with the energy of people building empires, chasing dreams, and creating the kinds of lives they'd always imagined. My reflection stared back from the glass, a woman transformed. At 68, I was more beautiful than I'd been at 48, when I'd still believed that sacrifice was the same as love. Success had given me a confidence that radiated from within, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with serving someone else's needs. "Mrs. Simpson," my assistant Jennifer's voice came through the intercom, "the Forbes reporter is here for your interview. Send her in, please." The reporter was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who'd been documenting the rise of women entrepreneurs over 50. My story, the financial advisor who'd sacrificed her career for caregiving and then rebuilt her empire even stronger, had become something of a legend in business circles. "Ms. Morrison Simpson," the reporter said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "2 years ago, you were featured as one of the most successful comeback stories in financial services. Now you're being profiled as one of the most powerful women in California business. How does it feel?" I smiled, the expression genuine and warm. "It feels like coming home to myself." "Can you elaborate on that?" "For 23 years, I defined myself through someone else's needs. I thought love meant self-sacrifice, that marriage meant disappearing into another person's life. It took me decades to understand that real love requires mutual respect, and respect means valuing each other's dreams and autonomy." Your husband Connor's situation has been mentioned in previous articles. How is he doing? I felt the familiar absence of emotion when Connor's name came up. Connor is receiving the professional care he always said he preferred. He's in a long-term psychiatric facility where trained professionals can meet his complex medical and psychological needs. Do you visit him?
No.
Connor made it very clear during our marriage that he valued professional boundaries over family involvement. I'm respecting those preferences. What I didn't mention was that Connor had been transferred to 3 different facilities as his psychological condition continued to deteriorate. The last report I'd received from his psychiatrist indicated that he spent most of his time in a near catatonic state, occasionally rousing himself to ask for his wife before remembering that his wife had moved on with her life. Some critics have suggested that your treatment of your husband has been harsh. I turned away from the window, meeting the reporter's gaze directly. I gave Connor Simpson 23 years of my life. I sacrificed my career, my independence, my identity, and my dreams to care for him. In return, he called me a good-for-nothing free maid and planned to have me declared mentally unstable so he could replace me with paid professionals. I leaned back in my chair, my voice taking on the steel that had made me legendary in boardroom negotiations. I don't consider it harsh to give someone exactly what they ask for. Connor wanted professional care instead of a devoted wife. He has it. He wanted boundaries instead of unconditional love. He has those too. But don't you think? I think, I interrupted, that women spend far too much time feeling guilty for refusing to accept mistreatment in the name of love. Connor had every opportunity to value what he had. He chose to devalue it instead. I stood up, walking to the bookshelf that held my business awards, professional certifications, and the photo from my second Financial Women magazine cover. Connor taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that you can't love someone into respecting you. Either they value you or they don't. And if they don't, the kindest thing you can do for both of you is walk away. After the interview ended, I spent the evening at a client dinner with tech executives who valued my expertise and paid me handsomely for it. The conversation was stimulating, the wine was excellent, and I was treated as an equal by some of the most successful people in the industry. Driving home to my elegant house in Pacific Heights, the house I'd bought for myself after selling the home I'd shared with Connor, I reflected on the completeness of my transformation. Morrison & Chun Financial had become the most respected wealth management firm on the West Coast, largely due to my return and the publicity surrounding my story. I personally managed over $400 million in client assets, earned more money than I'd ever imagined possible, and had been invited to speak at financial conferences around the world. But more importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self. I was no longer someone's caregiver, someone's wife, someone's definition of what a woman should be. I was Christabel Morrison Simpson, a force in my own right, someone who commanded respect because of her intellect, expertise, and professional accomplishments. My phone buzzed with a text from Vivian Chin. The Singapore clients want to meet next week. This could be our biggest account yet. I smiled and texted back. Book the flights. I'm available. Available. After 23 years of being constantly needed, constantly on call, constantly responsible for someone else's well-being, I was finally available for opportunities, adventures, and experiences that had nothing to do with managing someone else's decline. That weekend, I attended a gallery opening in Soho, the kind of sophisticated cultural event I'd missed for decades, while Connor demanded my attention for everything from adjusting his pillows to cutting his food. I wore a black Armani dress that cost more than Connor's monthly facility fees and engaged in conversations about art, politics, and business with people who had never known me as anyone's caregiver. Christabel. A familiar voice called out across the gallery. I turned to see Dr. Patricia Williams, my divorce attorney, approaching with a glass of champagne. Patricia, what a wonderful surprise. How are you? Thriving. I should be asking you the same question. You look absolutely radiant. We found a quiet corner where we could catch up properly. Patricia had become something of a celebrity herself after successfully representing several high-profile women in complex divorce cases. I've been following your career comeback in the news, Patricia said. It's been incredible to watch. It's been incredible to live, I replied. Patricia, I can't thank you enough for what you did during the guardianship case. You gave me back my life. You gave yourself back your life, Christabel. I just provided the legal framework. We talked for an hour about business, travel, and the kinds of opportunities that opened up when women stopped defining themselves through their relationships with men. As the evening wound down, Patricia asked the question I'd been expecting. Any regrets about Connor? I considered the question seriously. Did I regret 23 years of marriage? The love I'd felt? The devotion I'd shown? The sacrifices I'd made? I regret how long it took me to understand that I was worth more than being someone's unpaid caregiver, I said finally. But I don't regret walking away when I finally figured it out. He's not doing well, from what I hear. Connor is receiving exactly what he asked for, professional care from people who see him as a patient rather than a person. If he's unhappy with that arrangement, he had 23 years to appreciate something better. I finished my champagne, setting the empty glass on a nearby table. Patricia, some people spend their entire lives trying to teach others how to love them. I spent 2 decades doing that. Connor never learned. And now I love myself enough to demand respect from everyone in my life. It's a much better arrangement. Driving home that night, I passed the exit that would have taken me toward Riverside Manor, where Connor spent his days in group therapy sessions designed for people with severe cognitive impairment. For a moment, I imagined him in his wheelchair, medicated into compliance, asking the nurses when his wife would visit. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret, not sympathy. Just the absence of emotion that comes when someone has completely removed themselves from your heart. Connor Simpson had called me a good-for-nothing free maid. He had planned to discard me when I was no longer useful. He had spent 23 years taking everything I had to give while valuing me as nothing more than domestic help. In return, I had given him exactly what he'd asked for, a life without my love, my care, my devotion, or my presence. A life where professionals managed his needs with the same emotional investment he'd shown for mine. Some might call it cruel. I called it educational. As I pulled into my driveway, I smiled at the sight of my beautiful home, a place I'd chosen, decorated, and filled with things that brought me joy rather than medical equipment and accessibility modifications. A place where I lived for myself rather than serving someone else's needs. Tomorrow, I would fly to Singapore to meet with clients who valued my expertise enough to pay me more in 1 week than Connor's care facility cost in 6 months. I would use my mind, my skills, and my experience to build wealth for people who treated me as a trusted advisor rather than a servant. I would live the life I'd earned, successful, respected, and completely, utterly free. Connor had wanted to treat me like hired help. Instead, he taught me that I was worth far more than he could ever afford to pay. The student had finally surpassed the teacher, and the teacher would spend the rest of his life paying for the lesson. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of betrayal, awakening, and ultimate triumph. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the relationships in your own life and the value of demanding respect, please subscribe to her journey and hit that notification bell. Share this story with others who need to hear it, because sometimes the most important lesson we can learn is that love without respect is just another form of slavery. Until next time, this is Christabel Morrison Simpson, reminding you that you are worth more than being someone's unpaid caregiver, that your dreams matter, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away from people who refuse to value what you give them. Stay strong, stay independent, and never let anyone convince you that sacrifice and servitude are the same thing as love.